Hey everybody, it's Atheist for the Cause here with another video for you, and I wanted to talk about this new quote-unquote bombshell report. That actually, I think to most people, they're starting to get it, at least the Brexiteers, they're starting to get it that mass immigration, is a net negative, but there's some evidence to actually prove it now. And so if you're on the Remain side and you pretty much assume that mass immigration is a net positive, then this is a bombshell report for you. So let's take a look at this article. It says that bombshell report, mass immigration is costing Britain £17 billion each year. Now, that's probably a little more than I expected, but that's a lot. So, of course, how do they calculate that and all of that? So, we have to look into the finer details to make sure it's, warranted. And these numbers can be skewed pretty easily. So, it says, mass immigration is costing British taxpayers $17 billion a year, a bombshell report warned last night. But it said the UK could save $1.2 billion by quitting the EU. A detailed study of the costs of migration to Britain set against its benefits showed an overwhelmingly negative impact on the Treasury. The burden of public services, benefits, and pensions for migrants and their families far outstrips the income from what they pay in taxes. So that gives us a little insight on what they're calculating, and it says the burden of public services, benefits, and pensions for migrants and their families far outstrips the income from what they pay in taxes. It says migrants contributed £89.7 billion in taxes, but received $106.7 billion in public spending during 2014 and 2015, the report shows. Now, whether you agree with the report or not and how they do their calculations, it shows that this isn't just like some complete bullshit, survey or something. Like, this is an actual study or report that they looked at specific things to get these numbers. They're not just pulling these numbers out of their asses. So, they can still be calculating this the wrong way, in ways that some people might disagree with, but at least they're putting some serious time and energy into figuring this out. The cost to taxpayers included a staggering $20 billion paid in working age benefits. The crippling $17 billion annual shortfall, equivalent to nearly £63 for every UK household, was estimated in a report published by population think tank Migration Watch UK. Now, they probably have their own Migration Watch UK makes me think that they're anti-immigration, but it doesn't necessarily make their findings wrong. And, everybody has a bias these days, so. But, it's, I think for people who, 17 billion, it's like, what does that even mean? Well, I think if you think of it in the $63 for every UK household, that's what it's costing. That's actually quite a bit of money, especially for people who don't have a lot of money. So, and you're talking, this is just for immigration that isn't really benefiting, the poor middle class. The only class that's really benefiting would be the rich. So, and there are other factors like it depresses wages and things like that. So, the cost could even be considered to the average UK household, to be greater, because this is just, the flat rate, not the amount that's their wages are being depressed, or, if someone becomes unemployed because an immigrant took their job, how do you put that into a number? So says Lord Green of Dendington, chairman of the think tank, said, "This report shows EU migration is not making the positive fiscal contribution that has so often been claimed. Furthermore, it is adding to the rapidly increasing pressures on housing and public services. It also contributes a population increase of 500,000 every year, roughly a city the size of Liverpool." The UK isn't exactly a country with a lot of land, you know what I mean? So to take in that amount of immigration, it's going to catch up to the UK eventually. It's just not sustainable long term. The estimate of 89.7 billion contributed by migrants included 42.3 billion in income tax and national insurance, 28.5 billion in VAT and other indirect taxes, and 18.9 billion in business rates and other related levies. So that gives you some more insight into the numbers. The figure of 1.67 billion public spending on migrants in the same year included 8.8 billion in state pension, 18.6 billion for NHS treatment, and 18 billion on education. Migrant families benefited from 39.9 billion pounds spent on policing roads and other public services and infrastructure. They also received 21.4 billion in working age welfare payments, including jobless benefits, housing benefit, and tax credits. Non-European migrants were the greatest burden on the taxpayer. According to the report. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words a bit, but so it does show that, and this is to be expected, but immigrants from within the EU cost less than those from outside the EU. My guess is this has a lot to do with speaking the language. And of course, like the French don't speak English as their first language, but a lot of the EU countries also teach English on top of their native language. So, if you're talking about immigrants from outside of the EU, especially in Africa and stuff, most of those people aren't going to know English. Especially if you're not picking and choosing. So, it says, migrants from within the European Economic Area, which includes the EU, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, contribute 31.2 billion in taxes, and they benefited from 32.4 billion in public spending, a net cost of 1.2 billion, which could be avoided by leaving the EU. So just in terms of, the economic terms, these, the movement within the EU, that's not actually the big problem. That net loss is not very much. It's something, but it's not that much. And I don't think people would care that much in terms of the economics. Now you're talking like the big problem is the EU allows, all these immigrants from outside of the EU in, and then say they go to Germany, then they can go to any country within the EU once they get to Germany. So it really exposes the entire EU to like the most lax policies. Whatever country has the most lax policies. So that's a good reason for getting out of the EU. And there are also cultural issues. When you, for the most part, there are differences within EU countries, but the EU countries are going to be a lot closer than people from non-EU countries. maybe like Western societies like the US, Canada, Australia, and those non-EU countries would do just fine in the UK. But when you start talking like, some of the Asian countries, especially the poor ones, and just poor countries in general, some of the African countries, especially the poor ones, that's where you're going to get these huge discrepancies. And not only economically, but in terms of values. It says UKIP MEP and migration spokesman Stephen Wolf said, the report highlights what UKIP has been saying for 4 years. It shows the real cost of immigration to be astronomical. It is unaffordable when we see a rising national debt and public services under pressure. It also highlights the long-term effects of migration on pensions. Okay, the UK really has to change their debt situation, because they don't seem to care about debt at all. Like, if you think the US is bad, with our $20 trillion debt or whatever, the flat debt rate is not what you have to look at. You have to look at GDP per or debt per GDP, basically. So you can see like what the percentage is of the country's yearly income to their debt. And the U.S. is at like 105%, where the debt is like 105% of our GDP. So if we put our entire GDP for a year towards our debt would be pretty much paid off. Obviously, you can't put the entire thing, but that's just to give you an idea of what that percentage means. The UK is over 500%. So they would, if they put every dollar of their GDP towards their debt for 5 years, it still wouldn't be paid off. And what's a little more ridiculous and frustrating to me as an American is the United States has forgiven lots of debt to the UK over world wars. And so it's quite irresponsible to get your debt forgiven and then just run it right up like that terribly. And then to have these policies that push it up even further unnecessarily. Like, if it's because you're trying to make a better life for your people or whatever, it's still irresponsible to outspend like a crazy amount, but at least you're trying to make a better life for your own people, and that's the government's job. But when you're like trying to make a better life for people that are outside of your government, that's very irresponsible, because not only are you not sustaining your own people, you're not sustaining the extra people you're bringing in. So when everything collapses, which eventually it will if things don't change, it hurts everybody that's there, including those outside people you tried to help. So there needs to be a fundamental shift in spending in the UK. And, hate to say it, but, healthcare. These countries haven't really figured out healthcare yet. Where there is government healthcare, I mean, we're seeing very high debt ratios. There are some countries that have government healthcare and, they're not in this huge debt, but one country is Canada. The thing is, most of those countries have like really high natural resources. So, if you're an oil country, well, of course you can, that's a bit of a benefit when you're selling all this oil. But that's even like not sustainable. And what happens when when countries start shifting off of oil, and you're going to have to drop these policies anyways. So I think we need to do a better job of figuring out. I don't think the U.S., gives healthcare to enough people. We do need to improve, healthcare for the poor and stuff, but I don't think we need to take on the policies of other countries where government has taken it over and really run up huge costs, or they've, run the actual healthcare into the ground and stunted innovation and that kind of thing. So I'm not against government-run healthcare in principle necessarily. I think a kind of hybrid's probably the best. I think the government has to pay for the poor, and and it's best if the private market pays for the healthy, and that can drive innovation in the private, or in the business market, and then the government can follow the lead of the innovation that has that the businesses have provided and implemented. Because the government isn't going to innovate. We've even seen that in Australia and other countries where the government has taken over the internet, and like at first their internet's fine and their speeds will actually be a little higher, and they'll get internet to everybody, despite the costs. And then innovation stunts. So that's been terrible in Australia. So, and while the U.S. might not get the internet to as many people, because we're doing it by business, we are innovating, and our trend is upwards, and long term we'll be in a far better position than a lot of European and other Western, even South Korean, even Australian, like all these other countries. We'll actually be doing far better in just a few years. So in terms of internet speed, accessibility, and all of that. And remember, in terms of the internet, this is a little off-topic rant, but don't forget that the U.S. has a lot more land mass to cover. So South Korea has a lot of people in a very small area. And they do share their internet, so the actual speed they give their customers isn't as fast, because you lose speed every time you split it. So say you have 10 units of speed and you split it between two people. Each person isn't going to necessarily get 5 units of speed. Each person, say, will get 4 units of speed, and 2 units of speed will be lost. So anyways, back to this. It says Tory MP Tom Pursglove agreed the report showed the need to quit the EU in the next month's referendum, adding, on June 23rd, the British people have an opportunity to take back control of our borders and have controlled immigration. A vote, and remember, that's not just economic, that's about values and other things, it's about security and things like that. A vote to remain in the EU is a vote for uncertainty and a vote for uncontrolled immigration. It would be a mess if you're in the EU and it collapses. So, a government spokesman said these figures do not take account of the contributions to the UK economy that migrants have made over their lifetimes. And I think this is actually a good point and a relevant point. They're saying that I'm assuming it's true. So basically that this report is only looking at what the migrants are doing right now. But, say if they're not giving much to the economy because, say, for instance, they don't speak English, well, 10 years down the line, they might start speaking English, and that might open up job opportunities. And then I would even go beyond lifetime, future generations. Usually the second or third generation is when, integration happens at a much better rate, and the children are are basically, they grew up it's like the third generation. They grew up in the country with the language, with the culture, and they're not the first ones to do it. Like, their fathers did it and mothers did it, and their grandparents were the ones that immigrated. Though that's the generation that really takes a huge leap. But that doesn't mean that that's enough to account for the net negative that they're doing right now. So, this one comment doesn't really account for enough in there. What are those figures then? What should we expect in the future? And I don't think the UK should expect immigrants 10 years from now to have made up the huge debt, that they piled up. That debt will still be there. Data released by HMRC only last week showed recently arrived EU migrants paid $2.5 billion more in tax than they received in tax credits or child benefit in 2013-2014. And I don't find that very relevant. So basically, EU migrants paid slightly more than they received, but that's not accounting for the many other things this report accounts for, such as, you're going to have to build more roads, and you're going to have to repair roads more often, and there's a lot more than what this comment is taking into consideration. So now, what I did want to show you is how this applies to the United States. And I wanted to show that like a United States report kind of corroborates, this report here, because it's hard to know whether to believe these figures or not. This is such complicated stuff. So let's look at a report in the USA and what that was costing us, what mass immigration was costing us, even though we're not near what the UK has had in terms of issues with mass immigration. It says mass immigration costs government $296 billion a year, depresses wages. Immigration, and this is from September 21st, 2016. So that's this was written under the Obama administration as well. Immigration drains the government, sapping as much as $296 billion a year from federal, state, and local taxpayers, while depressing wages, at least in the short run, according in an authoritative study released Wednesday by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. The 500-page academic tome is supposed to be the final word about the fiscal economic efforts of mass immigration, and its findings challenge some long-held assumptions of Washington policymakers that immigration is an unqualified benefit. The data show that immigrants take more in benefits than they pay in taxes. And this is what, I think most people who live in just the lower and middle class people who live in the country and really that make up the country, they can usually tell this. They can feel it. It's the rich that's out of touch with this point. And even it's interesting because even the poor and middle class that defend immigration, they usually don't say that immigration or immigrants take more benefits than they pay in taxes. They usually don't argue against that. They'll make like a long-term argument like the other paper did, or something like that. They so it's only the rich that usually tend to make an argument that immigrants are a huge benefit to the economy, or the economists, because basically they look at how the rich are doing. Although immigrants do boost the size of the economy, the gains are heavily skewed toward the immigrants themselves and to wealthy investors, not to native-born workers who end up competing with the new arrivals. And this is what, in terms of Brexit, what I have been arguing. I'm an American, but I've been arguing. I argued a lot for Brexit, and I tried to convince the British public that, you have to vote Brexit to help your situation if you're poor or middle class. And it's because, your wages will be depressed otherwise, and unemployment will go up. You'll have more competition, and these aren't things that impact the rich. So it says, in fact, it helps the rich because, if say you own a business and you're hiring a lot of workers, the depressed wages increase your profit. So it actually increases income inequality. Mass immigration does. It reminds us the big beneficiaries of immigrants are the immigrants themselves and American businesses. And that's a point I didn't think of. Not that I didn't really realize it, but sometimes there's a difference between, understanding something and really bringing it to the conscious level, where, obviously immigrants themselves are benefiting. And I haven't made that point enough, so I guess I should make that point more. That an immigrant, say, especially if you're talking refugees, but, if they're going to die or something, getting them out of there benefits them. But at least in the short term, I don't think this is talking refugees, so it's just immigrants. In the short term, immigrants are improved. That's why they come to or go to another country. So there can be long-term costs to the immigrant, though. And, consider a lot of, if an immigrant goes to a country and then, that they're a drain on the country and too many immigrants come, in terms of mass immigration, and the debt goes way up and jobs go way down, or the economy gets hurt. It's them that could lose their job long term as well. And so, did an immigrant who comes here and works for 5 years and then loses their job, did they really get benefited? Because now they lost 5 years and they lost the potential to go up the ladder, I mean, that past experience will help them a little, but now what do? Especially if they barely know English. Are they going to go, back to, say they came from Mexico, are they going to go back to Mexico? Say they came from Quebec, are they going to go back to Quebec where they're French speaking? It could really hurt them long term. And I don't know if this paper really considered that, but I think the huge winner is the American business people that benefit from the depressed wages and extra labor. The losers tend to be the poor, said Stephen A. Camarada, research director of the Center for Immigration Studies, who is one of the report's official reviewers but was not part of the formal panel that wrote it. He's not calling them the poor losers. He's saying that the people who lose the most in all of this are the native-born poor people. The report also concludes that the new arrivals aren't assimilating as well as past waves of immigrants. They struggle to learn English and to increase their wages at the rates of immigrants just a few decades ago. I made, these points previously, and I think the UK these points definitely translate to the UK. Written in heavily caveated economic language, the report tested a number of models of economic and fiscal policy based on different assumptions about immigration. That meant the scholars came up with ranges of outcomes rather than firm answers. But those ranges were sometimes conclusive, particularly when it came to government finances. The researchers tested 8 scenarios, and in each of them, taxpayers came out worse. So, some people will argue that it depends on the variables and how you look at this stuff. Well, according to these researchers, every way they looked at it, which was 8 different ways, the taxpayers came out worse. And because the assumptions you make can have a big impact on the conclusion from the model. The best case scenario put the federal government ahead but states behind, for a total loss of $43 billion in 2013. The worst case scenario showed federal, state, and local governments losing $296 billion in 2013. So you're talking about a loss between $43 billion and $296 billion to the U.S. in 2013. And keep in mind, while our numbers are bigger, our issue is not as big as the issue the UK is facing and other countries in the EU. That would be equivalent to about 4% of total government spending that year. 4% of the total government spending is a lot, especially when you're as big as the US is. Francine de Blois, the Cornell University economics professor who led the academic panel, insisted the findings showed American workers had little to fear from immigration. It's like they just don't want to believe it, Like, it can't be true. The panel's comprehensive examination revealed many important benefits of immigration, including on economic growth. Economic growth for who? The rich? Innovation and entrepreneurship. Do you have some sort of numbers or some sort of quantification for that? With little to no negative effects on the overall wages little. How are you defining little? Because, what I've read in the past is that mass immigration has depressed wages about 5%. That's not little. That's basically a sales tax. At least in the United States, that's about a sales tax. With little to no negative effects on the overall wages or employment of native-born workers in the long term, the professor said. Well, if she's a professor, or he's it was a him, I think, yeah. If he's a professor, then he must be right. Oh, she said, though, that the picture for government finances is more mixed and acknowledged negative effects on budgets of states, which have to pay for the costly education of immigrants' children. And how about the negative impact on the native-born people, the U.S. citizens that go to these schools and get a worse education because there's less money per person? There are bigger class sizes, things like that. There's less time. How do you quantify the value of time from a teacher? So now class sizes are going up to, 40 when they were 30, or maybe they're going up to 35 when they were 25. But these children of immigrants on average go to be the most positive fiscal contributors in the population, she said in a statement. I'm not sure, that's only true if you're picking immigrants, which the UK is not doing. So if that's true in the US, it's only because we're picking who's coming here, and it wouldn't be true in the UK. George J. Boras, a professor at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, who was part of the panel that prepared the report, praised Ms. Blah for leading the effort, saying in a blog post that she was patient, fair, and professional. That's kind of weird wording, but whatever. The conclusions he took from the report, though, painted a decidedly grimmer picture of immigration's fiscal and economic costs, particularly in the short run, for workers whose skills most closely match those of the new arrivals. I mean, this should be obvious to people, especially professionals, like, who look at this stuff. The economic impact of immigration, and it's certainly obvious to those who are the people who have skills that most closely match those of the new arrivals. You know, those who do construction and things like that. The economic impact of immigration is, at best, a net wash for the average native-born person, he said. The gains, and I think that's being generous to call it a net wash, but he did say at best. The gains accruing from the immigrants' productive contributions are probably offset by the fiscal burden, but even though the mythical average person is unaffected, some groups gain a lot and some groups lose a lot. And that's a key. Thomas Sowell taught me that in his book, where one key thing is you can't just look at broad numbers, and people economists fall into this trap all the time. You know, for instance, take the amount of illegal immigrants that come into the United States. There's around 11 to 12 million in the U.S. now. So those, 11 to 12 million aren't all in one place, or aren't all spread out evenly in the country. They go to, just a couple of places. California takes in most of them, and Arizona takes in a bunch. Texas takes in a bunch. So Florida gets a bunch. But northern countries don't get nearly as many, or northern states usually. So unless they actively draw them by being a sanctuary city or a state or something like that. But and that I was also telling that to people before the Brexit vote is, this is straining certain communities, and Tommy Robinson was really telling people, in his town of Luton, where there were a lot of immigrants and Muslims going to settle in Luton, and it's not a proportional amount to the rest of the country. It was on the high side, and it hurt his city a lot more than it hurt the rest of the UK. But people don't factor that in. So those who compete with immigrants effectively sending billions and billions of dollars annually to those who are immigrants. Underlying the report is the large increase in immigration in recent years. During the 1980s, the country took in about 600,000 migrants a year. In the early 1990s, it was about 800,000 a year. But since the dawn of the century, the country has averaged more than 1 million legal immigrants a year. They accounted for 42.3 million people in 2014, which was about 13% of the population. Dang, that's a lot. 600,000 migrants a year. I know in Hillary Clinton, one of the reasons I voted against Hillary Clinton, although I voted for Trump because I actually like Trump, but Hillary Clinton's number was 500,000 a year. And given that it looks like Bill Clinton brought in 800,000 a year in the 90s, and in the 80s it was 600,000 a year, she probably actually would have done at least 500,000 and maybe more. As many as 400,000 illegal immigrants also arrive each year. and that was just for, I guess that was just for refugees that Clinton wanted. There were, I guess that wouldn't include all the legal immigrants. As many as 400,000 illegal immigrants also arrive each year, though they are balanced by about the same number of illegal immigrants, either returning home, dying, or gaining some form of legal status. So their number remains static at slightly more than 11.1 million this decade. And I think we're gonna get below that 11 million with Trump in office, because he's been deporting like crazy. And it's not just the deportation. Obama actually deported a lot, but the thing is, Trump's open about it, and he's given the tough talk. Obama was still encouraging them to come, so they were basically coming, and then when they got here, they were getting deported. And then they just keep trying to come, whereas they're self-deporting under Trump, because he's making it very clear that, policies are going to be tough for illegal immigrants here, because they're not good for anybody. And long term, it's a tough situation for the legal immigrants themselves to constantly be undocumented and be in a constant state of breaking the law. They usually have to do other things too to break the law further, to get social security numbers that are faked and that kind of thing. Says, for years, orthodoxy among both parties in Washington was that while legal immigration was complicated, legal immigration was unqualified good that should be increased. Voters, however, have been long been skeptical, telling pollsters that they wanted the level of legal immigration either to be kept or the same or reduced. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump tapped into the sentiment by calling for an immigration system that serves Americans, drawing fierce rebukes from Democrats and immigrant rights groups that said he was bordering on xenophobia and risking U.S. economic sufficiency. At least this article says he was bordering on xenophobia, and that other people are making the claim and not calling him an outright racist, sexist, xenophobic bigot. A report released Wednesday by the liberal-leaning Center from American Progress argued that deporting illegal immigrants would oust 7 million people, or about 5%, from the workforce. That would shave $4.7 trillion off the economy for the next decade, or about 2%. That's more fear-mongering than anything, because that's not going to happen overnight. And, we had an unemployment rate of like 5 or 6%. That's not including, like, when you include it all together. I think it was like 10 to 12% when you include like people who were deemed not in the workforce anymore because they were unemployed for so long. Because if you're from Europe or outside the U.S., you might not realize that. Even some in the U.S. don't realize that if you're not looking for work for longer than, or if you're looking for work and can't find it for longer than like 2 years or something, they just consider you not employed anymore, or not in the labor force anymore, and you don't count towards the unemployment rate then. And then, of course, there are, if you include all of the people who are having like part-time jobs, and Trump talked about this, he said like the actual unemployment rate is like 30 to 40%, and some people are like, that's crazy. Well, he said unemployment, but he's really including underemployed people. Mass deportation is a policy of all loss and no gain. To define that further, underemployed, that would be people who don't have full-time jobs, basically. So mass deport, that want them. Because basically in the U.S. you need a full-time... Sorry, I almost dropped my mic. You need a full-time job to have a living wage. So otherwise you need to put together 2 or 3 part-time jobs, which is not good for the worker. It says mass deportation is a policy of all loss and no gain, said Tom Jowitz, the Center's vice president of immigration policy. Okay, so you don't necessarily need to go through a mass deportation. The UK is finding this out as we speak. Just the talk of all of this, workers are all already leaving. Immigrants are already leaving the UK, self-deporting. In the US, they're self-deporting. I think, like, illegal immigration is down like 70% or something like that. It's crazy numbers, and they're self-deporting themselves like crazy. So you don't have to go through this mass deportation. And I actually recommend that you don't, because if you do forced mass deportation, it can get pretty brutal. Now, there are times where you have to select certain individuals and deport them because they're threats to the public and things like that, but overall, you don't want to be going down that road as much. So, that's that. It gives you an idea of what the cost is to the U.S. or what it was in 2013, and I would say our mass immigration issue is not nearly as bad as the UK's, and the UK's, they're saying that it's costing $17 billion a year. So I actually believe these numbers. And it might actually be even worse than these reports are finding, but I think these numbers are perfectly reasonable. So anyways, I think, you guys did a good job voting Brexit. And now you need to, in my opinion, it's up to you, but you got to vote for the Conservatives to force Brexit to go through and to get a good deal, while you leave Brexit. You might not like the Conservatives, but this is like a once-in-a-lifetime situation. And then they might screw you over on social policies and things like that, but then you can correct it in the next election. And I'm going to predict this now. What you're going to see is the Conservatives just probably win pretty easily in this coming election. Even though the polls are tightening now, I think you're going to see the Conservatives in the end win it pretty easily. And I think they'll get a majority themselves. And then you'll see a huge backlash, because it's like, say, you're fighting for civil rights, say women's rights. And say you're trying to gain, back then when they were trying to gain the right for women to vote. And then they accomplish their mission and women can vote. Well, that's no longer an issue. So people who were voting for the party that was pushing, the right for women to vote, now they're going to reassess who they're going to vote for based on what's left. And I think the Conservative Party is going to have a huge issue after this Brexit issue is accomplished. So, and that's what makes me worry long term. Not worry, but I doubt long term that the UKIP party is going to take hold, because Brexit was their thing. And, Nigel Farage, he's not really continuing in the UKIP party as like a leader, and they're kind of missing a good face now, because Nigel was he's an amazing face for their party, and I just don't see, unless they completely reinvent the party, I don't see where the British are gonna suddenly come around to them. So it'll be Conservatives this year, and then who knows in the future where the people go. It might be a brand new party. It might be, Labour or Liberal Democrats. But I really don't think that. I think Conservatives are in for a rude awakening post-Brexit. So, all right. Have a good day, guys.